I sometimes think it's crazy that I've learned to speak 8 foreign languages, but what's even crazier is that it all started on top of a mountain in Argentina under a full moon when I stopped breathing. In this video, I'm going to tell you what happened in this near-death experience and how what I learned from that helped me to learn 8 languages. But it's not really about me, because from this story, you are going to discover what I think is the biggest secret of language learning that will help you learn any new language to a high level faster and have a lot more fun doing it. So let's get to it. It was the 22nd of December 2004 and I was in Irusha, which is a tiny village in the mountains in the north of Argentina at about 3,000 meters of altitude, right there on the border with Bolivia. I was learning Spanish at the time. I wasn't doing very well. I didn't enjoy studying the language. I was still a beginner. I was just sitting down with textbooks, memorizing verb tables, things like that. Not only was this method boring, but it really didn't work for me at all. So there I was in 2004, up in this village, Irusha, and we just had a really fun night with some friends that I was traveling with, eating steak and drinking Malbec. And we'd gone to bed, and I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't breathe. And as you can imagine, this is not a very nice feeling. So panicking, I jumped out of bed, I ran outside to see if, get moving and getting some fresh air might make a difference. But it didn't, nothing. And I really started to panic then, which made the situation a lot worse. I was heaving, like desperately trying to get some oxygen into my lungs. And I remember thinking to myself very clearly, like, is this it? Is this where it all ends? And there was this haunting view of the valley here up in the mountains from that balcony in the hostel. And this is still etched in my mind today like a photo. But eventually the breathing started to return. I don't know why, but it did. And I was kind of trembling. So I sat down in my chair and I just focused on my breath like my life depended on it. Now, I was too scared to go back to sleep. So I picked up a book that I had bought a few weeks earlier on a whim and I hadn't opened yet. And this was Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In Spanish, it's called Crónica de una muerte anunciada. A very famous book. But the book was in Spanish. And because I didn't want to go back to bed, I picked up the book and I started reading. I'd never read a book before in Spanish, and I was still a beginner, so it was quite hard, and there was a lot that I didn't understand from the book. But there was no way I was going back to sleep, and we didn't have cell phones back then, so I just kept reading. And by the way, if you ever read a book in another language, let me know what it was in the comments below. So now we flash forward to the next day, and I was just walking through the village in the midday sun. It was beautiful. It felt very different. I felt different. I felt fine. I was still a little shaken from the night before, but my mind was on something else. Because what I found was, walking through the streets of that village, there were words in Spanish in my head that weren't there the day before. Spanish words. Certain words and phrases would pop up into my mind as I was walking down the street. And they were words from the story, from this book that I'd been reading. Now, usually when I learn languages with a textbook or whatever it was, the words that, like from my classes or the textbook, they never stick in my mind the first time. Like, if ever, you know what that feeling's like. But after just a couple of hours spent reading a Spanish story in the moonlight of the Argentine mountains, new words had been pretty firmly planted in my brain. By the way, researchers have known about this for a long time. Check out this video if you want to hear more about why this happens. Now, over the next couple of weeks, I kept reading that same book, and by the end of my trip up in the north, I'd finished reading that. I'd finished reading my first ever book in Spanish. And here's what's interesting. While I was reading the book, I could tell that I was learning, but the real surprise came later. I went back to Buenos Aires, the capital, where I was going to stay with some friends. And you see, last time I'd been there, I really had a hard time following the conversations in Spanish. I couldn't say much, couldn't understand much. But what I found when I went back was everything was suddenly very different. It was like a new world. The transformation in my Spanish was almost as shocking as that feeling of almost dying on top of that mountain. I discovered that it wasn't just a few new words that I had learned from that. There was a lot more. My grammar was better because I think I just noticed all these patterns over and over again in the story. My listening comprehension had improved because I was able to understand so many more words. And my speaking was also much more fluent because I simply knew so much more Spanish. But that's not even the best thing. The best thing of all, I discovered a way to learn Spanish that was fun and motivating. Because, I'd been getting really depressed with the traditional textbooks and classes that I'd been doing before. It really wasn't working for me. But this way of learning through story, it motivated me to keep reading every day because I wanted to find out what happened at the end. And this is why I now believe that the simple key to language learning success is reading. It's reading stories. And this is where my whole story learning method comes from. And it made perfect sense as well that that was the case. Because when you're learning from a textbook in a class or from a teacher, traditional methods of learning, there's only so much that you can fit in during that class time or in that textbook chapter, right? When you're choosing specific things in advance to learn in each lesson, there's not enough time, there's not enough space in the book. And that's why it's so common to hear complaints like, Ollie, I want to enjoy myself when I'm learning, not bore myself to tears with grammar and exercises. I want to be able to learn at home, not to just spend all my time in class. I want to learn to speak without having to force myself to be in these awkward social situations all the time. These are the things that people tell me all the time, but learning through story changes that because when you read, you just take in so much more information. You see 100 times more new words in a story than you ever will in a textbook. You see the full range of the grammar of the language being used in the story. You learn how people speak from the dialogue in the story. Now, obviously you don't remember or learn everything, but you don't have to. All you have to do is keep going, keep reading. Notice how the language is being used, and your brain can soak up what it needs when it needs it while you just enjoy your time with the language. Every part of the story I've told you here is true, including that rapid transformation in my Spanish. And I went on to learn 8 foreign languages using this approach. I'm still going strong. But you're probably wondering how you can use this approach to learn a new language yourself, especially if you're a beginner, because you can't just pick up any old book and just start reading, because if you're a beginner, you won't understand anything, right? Well, this is the topic of another video, so go and check that out. But before you do, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed the story.